it's really impressive, the society that you've put together. I think it's really excellent to see a society which is so active and so dynamic, and as I understand it, it's student-led or led by students and early career researchers. So that's really something you should feel very proud of, and it's really great to be able to be invited to participate in the initiative. So good luck to CogIST, and let's hope that CogIST is in as good health at the end of my talk as it has been up to now. So yeah, I'm going to share my slides, and then I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk for around 50 minutes on the topic of beyond volition. So I'm dealing with the cognitive neuroscience of voluntary action. And I'm going to try and do really three things in the next 50 minutes. First of all, I'm going to try to introduce as a topic of scientific discussion the deep intuitions that we have in our everyday lives about our own free will, and about what is called agent causation, which is the idea that people can just decide to do things and make things happen. I'm going to introduce some of the classical neuroscientific work which has tried to look at the basis of free will. I always put free will in quote marks. I think volition is a much safer word than free will, the basis of volition in the human brain. And I'm then going to take a moment to think about what we really want from a theory of volition. Why are we doing this? Why are we trying to study the mental and neural mechanisms of voluntary action? And I think the answer to that is because we want to understand something about the complexity of our own behavior. And I'm going to end with presenting briefly a couple of experimental projects, which I would call enriching volition, trying to give an account of human voluntary action, which is perhaps richer and more interesting than what we've had before, and therefore more able to do what we need an account of voluntary action to do. Okay, so the deep intuitions of free will and agent causation. So a good place to start in lots of talks is René Descartes, a great intellectual figure of the modern period. And what you might be expecting me to say is that René Descartes believed in free will. He did. And he believed that he had found the bridge between the mind and the body. And he did believe that, and he was wrong. But actually, that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is something that Descartes noticed, which is that many of our actions are responses to external stimuli. So the example in the original edition is that if your foot is too close to the fire, there is a signal that is conducted to the brain which causes you to withdraw your foot and to move it away in a reflex action. Now, Descartes got the mechanism completely wrong. He thought there was a fluid that flowed up your spinal cord and into your ventricles and then back down to your muscles. That's incorrect. We know it's actually the electrical conduction of neurons. But the interesting thing is that Descartes thought that this was the only mechanism of action in animals. The reflex mechanism was the only mechanism of action in animals. But he thought that human actions could go beyond being mere responses to external stimuli and could express free will. They had a level of autonomy which reflex actions lack. So Descartes quite rightly, I think, pointed out that some of our actions are responses to external stimuli, but some are not. Sometimes we decide to make an action for ourselves without any stimulus making us do it. And those are the actions which we might think of as being, quote, free will, unquote. We might think of them as being autonomous, and we might think of them as involving a cognitive function called volition, which we're going to discuss. So a simple example comes from the thought experiment in medieval philosophy called the Buridan's ass experiment. And in the Buridan's ass experiment, we imagine a donkey who is exactly between two tasty bales of hay, and the donkey is going to want to eat something, but it cannot decide whether to eat this bale of hay or this bale of hay because there's no external relevant difference between them. There's nothing in the stimulus which is saying that the donkey should go this way or go that way. So the donkey has to generate at least one bit of information in its own brain in order to approach one of these bales of hay and then eat it. I'm just going to switch on the pointer so that it's visible. So in the original medieval legend, the donkey couldn't decide which meal to eat and it died of starvation. In fact, this is not something people do. We're easily able all the time to generate decisions which then impact our actions. And this is considered to be really important in society because it's normally thought of as being the basis of legal and moral responsibility. So all human societies that I'm aware of, at least, have some sort of idea of you did that. You decided to make that action. And if that action was very bad, then you are responsible for the action and the consequences, and you might be punished. So what's quite interesting here is that you have a cognitive process which happens in the mind of the donkey, and it happens in my mind when I make decisions which are not based on external information. But it's a mental state of very high importance because it's the basis of the way that we live together. And I think it has to be. So volition, it's surprising that it's not in any of the psychology textbooks, given how much we need it to make society work. So we can ask then, what is the cause of these internal or endogenous actions? So there must be some reason why the donkey, moves to eat one meal rather than another. There must be some reason why I press the right button rather than the left button. And what are the internal causes that trigger our actions? Now, one thing that you can do is you can say, oh, well, the person had free will, and that's why they went this way or went that way, press this button, that button. And then what you're really doing is a kind of circular philosophical exercise. You're just inventing a concept which fills the gap in the model to explain to function as the cause of an action. That seems a little bit sort of bad from a piece of thinking. So instead, I think what we need to consider is the possible causes that might trigger our actions. So quite often, there are hidden environmental causes. So quite often, there are subtle factors which cause our actions, which we may not immediately recognize. This is the business of social psychology, is to tell us about the hidden environmental cues that actually direct what appear to be our autonomous actions. In other cases, the cause of our action could be some purely mechanistic but stochastic thing within our own nervous system. So there are plenty of examples in movement disorders neurology of how noise in the motor system can generate actions. And perhaps the most interesting one from the point of view of cognitive science is the role of memory. So we can often make an action which is caused not by the stimulus environment in front of us now, but is caused by, for example, our memory of what happened when we made an action in this context last time. Maybe we were successful, so we repeat it. Maybe we were unsuccessful, so we do something else. We may make actions which are based on our goals and our plans and our models and our intentions, some representation that we have in our cognitive system of potential future states of the world and ways that we can bring them about by goal-directed action. So the key point here, I think, which is quite interesting, is that we can't study volition by manipulating an external input. So the standard way that psychology works is that you have a black box model and you manipulate the inputs and you measure the outputs. So we can think of volition as being some mental state which causes actions. And the normal way that you would try to study how volition works is to manipulate the input and see how people behave, but that's not going to work if we define volition as being a mental state that doesn't have external manipulable inputs. So one of the methodological problems in studying human voluntary action in studying what you might call free will has been that we can't really use black box models because we can't manipulate the input. If I tell you to do something, if I say, please press the button, then I'm not sure that I can really claim I'm studying your voluntary action. I'm studying your response to my imperative stimulus. So you'll see that that's a big methodological constraint as the talk goes on, is we want to get people to behave, if you like, naturally or authentically or autonomously or voluntarily. And that makes it tricky to do experiments because the nature of experiments is that we want to have the highest level of experimental control possible. What we can do, however, is we can wait until volition spontaneously and naturally emerges. We can wait until people make voluntary actions, and then we can try to get biomarkers of the process which is producing them. And that's exactly what the main tradition has been in the study of voluntary action in the history of neuropsychology. So this paper, which originally appeared in 1964 by Kornhuber and Dieker, was a real seminal moment in the scientific study of volition, because it was the first convincing evidence for a biomarker of the process of generating voluntary actions. So what Kornhuber and Dieker did was a slightly strange experiment where they asked people to make a voluntary movement of the hand. So these are typically finger movements like this. And you are asked to make a voluntary movement of your finger when you want to, not in response to any stimulus. There's no go signal. The experimenter does not say move now. You just move when you want. Like this. So this is a very strange experiment. But if you do this and you look at what's happening in the brain, then what Kornhuber and Dieker noticed is that there's a pattern of activity before the finger moves, which they were able to isolate. It's noisy, so you have to average the EEG signal prior to multiple recordings of this voluntary action. So here what you can see is a timeline in seconds, with 0 being the moment that the finger actually moves. And you can see superimposed the recordings from several participants from different brain areas. So these top two are basically over the frontal lobes. And the critical point is that some time before the person actually moves, you can see a buildup of activity in the brain. And there's a long tradition of defining the components of this activity. So you can see, for example, a slow, gradual rise here, which then becomes more abrupt, reaches a maximum just about the time of the action itself, and then rapidly goes back down again. There's an interesting peculiarity, which those of you who study the EEG will know, which is that we very often plot negative up and positive down in EEG. And that's because you often find that when a brain area is active, you record a negative potential at the scalp immediately above. So negative up means that the readiness potential is this slow ramp-like negativity in the human brain, which begins, depending on how you set up the experiment, it begins 500 milliseconds before action, or if you look at this initial slow deflection, maybe a second before action, sometimes even longer. And this was very exciting because the key point that Kornhuber and Dieker made was that the participants were making these actions of their own free will, and it looked as though this build-up of activity in the frontal lobes could potentially be the cause of the voluntary actions that the people were making. So Kornhuber, I think, in particular, had felt that he had found the basis of free will in the human brain. And Benjamin Libet, some years later, I'll come back to some other parts of the Libet experiment, made an observation which it's been hard to sort of tie down and hard to do very good research on. But he found that basically the harder you think, the bigger and earlier the readiness potential is. So here what he shows is the average readiness potential in two sessions of an experiment. And in this session, the person reported spontaneously that they had been thinking very hard about what they were doing, and you get a big early readiness potential, which he called RP type 1. And in this session, the participant seems to have reported spontaneously that they didn't particularly think about the movements that they were making. They just moved, whenever. It wasn't a big deal. And you can see that there still is a readiness potential, but it's much smaller and much later. So it looks as though basically the stronger the cognitive activity associated with making the action, the bigger the readiness potential is. And this is a really quite interesting sort of dimension of the sort of cognitive motor interface, which has not been sufficiently analyzed in my view. Now, EEG has poor spatial resolution, although very good temporal resolution. If you do the same experiments in fMRI, and this is the work of Jenkins et al., where the senior author is my colleague Dick Passingham, you can see in PET neuroimaging, which has very good spatial but very poor temporal resolution, that when you compare a block of trials where people make the movement whenever they like with another block of trials where they receive a trigger stimulus which says, please move now, you can see that there's an enormous area of activity in the medial frontal cortex of both hemispheres, just roughly in front of the top of your head, which is an activation that is distinctively greater, significantly greater for voluntary actions compared to identical movements that are made in response to an external stimulus. So the supplementary motor area in general, we now talk about the supplementary and the pre-supplementary, but this whole complex in the medial frontal cortex seems to play a special role in voluntary actions. Now, Libet's data were collected in the context of an experiment which I'm sure many of you know, so I'll go over it quite quickly because it's fairly well known in the literature. Libet was quite interested in the relationship between the brain activity represented by the readiness potential and the conscious experience that we all have in our everyday life of deciding what to do and then doing it. So the conscious experience of deciding and controlling and willing our actions. So in the Libet experiment, the person is making voluntary actions. Here is our implementation of it. So the voluntary action is simply to press the button. And when we do our experiments, we do actually connect the button box to the computer. So this is just shown here, not connected, just for illustration purposes. And Libet, in fact, didn't look at key press movements. He used different kinds of hand movements, which we don't need to worry about. But the Libet experiment is one of these experiments where you have to make a voluntary action whenever you feel like it, with one additional element, which is that you're watching the hand of a clock going round every 2,560 milliseconds to provide a kind of mental chronometry, So the idea here is that you watch the clock going round and you note the position of the clock hand when you decide to make the voluntary action. If you read Libet's paper, then the words he actually uses are to note the position of the clock hand when you first felt the urge to move. So the word urge crops up again and again in the cognitive neuroscience of voluntary action. And it's not a very good word. It's not very helpful. It's the same word that Freud used to describe sexual urges. So that sort of is not really helpful in this context. But at any rate, the point is that Libet assumes that people have a specific experience of causing their voluntary action. And after they've pressed the button, the clock hand continues to rotate. It stops at a voluntary location, and the person reports to the experimenter the position of the clock hand when they first felt the urge to move, when they decided to press the button. In this case, they say, oh, I first felt the urge to move when the clock hand was at 23. We know that they actually pressed the button when the clock hand was at 25. And what this means is that if we line this up on a timeline with 0 as the moment when they actually pressed the button, we can register on this timeline the moment of conscious intention. Libet called it the W judgment, for the judgment of will. This is the moment at which you have the subjective experience of right, I'm going to press the button now. This is the moment at which, if you like, we subjectively experience our intention to press the button translating into the real physical action of pressing the button. And on average, this happens 206 milliseconds before the button goes down in Libet's experiment. Now, the interesting thing is that if you record EEG from the scalp while this is going on, then you will find that the readiness potential begins sometimes a second or more before the button press, and long before the moment that the person reports that they experience the conscious intention to move. So there's a period of time which in brain time is actually extremely long. It's often more than a second in duration, during which it looks as though your brain has unconsciously begun the preparation of the action that you're going to make. So the action is coming, but you don't yet know about it because you don't yet have the subjective experience of willing it. So this is clearly incompatible. I'm just going to skip to the next slide. This is clearly incompatible with the way that our sort of culture tells us our action works. So what our culture tells us is that our conscious intentions, our thoughts, get our brains active, which causes our actions, causes our body movements. This is a kind of a dualist view. If you're a neuroscientist, you can't possibly be a dualist because it looks like your consciousness is some sort of ghost which is able to switch on the machine of your brain. So although this is an idea which is deeply embedded in our culture, as neuroscientists, we can't believe it. What Libet does is to show that the order of recruitment that Cartesian concepts of free will require, consciousness first, brain second, is wrong. It's actually the other way around. What happens is you have unconscious brain activity, which causes our actions. And here you can see that there's a kind of a carbon copy or a sideline, which gives you an experience of conscious intention. I've drawn this in a dotted and a dashed line because I don't know what it means. I don't know what it's for. I don't know why we have that conscious experience. It certainly doesn't go anywhere. There's no arrow going out of this box. But to the extent that there is a conscious experience of feeling that you're about to move, it follows brain activity rather than causing brain activity. So the conclusion of the Libet experiment is the intuition that conscious thought causes action is a dualistic mistake. The origins of voluntary action lie in unconscious brain activity. Conscious free will is an illusion. And one reason I think why this experiment is so important is we clearly would need to find an alternative grounding for responsibility. So the way that we make social attributions of responsibility needs to change. That would be the message if you interpreted the Libet experiment as face value. Now, people have long criticized this experiment and said that it's not very good and it doesn't actually satisfy what we want from a theory of volition. And here are some of the criticisms, which I'll briefly go through. I'll come back to the first one. So one problem is this idea of urge. People don't experience a really strong phenomenal awareness of urge when they press buttons in laboratory experiments. Our experience of our own voluntary action is it's always there, but it's like a mental background. The vividness of the experience of action is very different from the vividness of the visual field. Our conscious experience of what we're doing is like a buzz that we're always aware of, rather than like the sort of salient, vivid phenomenology that you quite often get if you look out of the window, for example. People have often complained that these actions that are made in experiments like this are meaningless. There's no consequence for you or for me or for anybody if I press the button now or later or a bit earlier or not at all. What if somebody says, I'm not going to press the button and I quit and the experiment's over? Well, fine, who cares? So the whole point about the experiment, I suppose, is that the setting and the context and the social construction is very, very strange. Please come into the lab. Please sit down in front of this button and press this button when you feel like it. So be voluntary now is a very strange kind of experiment. So these comments are well respected critiques in the philosophy journals, and I want to particularly pick up on the point of biased sampling, because the whole field has been blown wide open by a recent paper by Aaron Scherger in PNAS, well over 10 years ago now, where Scherger proposed that maybe people had been misinterpreting the readiness potential as being a signal corresponding to the volitional command. Maybe the readiness potential is not really the cause of our voluntary action in that sense, because Scherger imagined that maybe the readiness potential is actually just neural noise. He synthesized lots and lots of examples of a neural noise with this leaky integrator equation, which is just accumulating until it reaches a threshold. And he hypothesized that maybe when this noise hits the threshold, that's when the person acts. So in an experiment like the Libet experiment, where you have to press the button anytime you feel like it, then a neural noise like this will always eventually, after a waiting time, which will be very variable from one trial to the next, will always diffuse up to the threshold, cross it, and then the person will press the button. And if you simply average all of these very, very noisy traces, what you get is something which looks remarkably like the average of the readiness potential. So Scherger plotted negative down instead of negative up. So I had to flip his graph, which is why this looks rather funny. So this is time in seconds. 0 is the time at which people press the button, -1, -2 seconds. And this is the EEG voltage in microvolts. So in gray, what you can see is empirical data from Scherger's recordings of the readiness potential in his participants. And in black is the model, which is simply the average of lots and lots of runs of this equation for random noise aligned on a particular threshold, which is fitted to the data. So random stochastic neural activity can be sufficient to explain these sorts of occasional behaviors that people make without an external stimulus in these sorts of experiments. You don't need to claim that there's any specific process of volition prior to action, and a random process is sufficient. Well, this is really interesting, and it's been a very dominant view recently in our understanding of voluntary action. It basically says that at least this feature of our voluntary action is random, not caused. And if that's true, then we're really finished, because not only can we not manipulate the input, but we can't really interpret what's going on in the black box as being a thing. We can't say there's a signal. We can't say there's a process. It might be that there's just noise, which leads to our actions. So that's pretty terrifying if you believe in responsibility. And there's some quite interesting questions in the Scherger paper about what follows from that. What I want to do now is detour a bit and say, well, what are we looking for from a theory of volition? What are we trying to explain about our own behavior, and what are we trying to achieve? So the picture of volition that you get from the Libet experiment is kind of minimalist. It's very, very thin. At the most, it will tell you about when people press buttons, which is not a super interesting problem or a super interesting question. And it doesn't make volition interesting or useful. So what can we do to make a theory of volition which is rich enough that we actually care about it? So this is important because we need volition, or many people want volition, to have some underpinning role in responsibility in society. So Daniel Dennett has been particularly sort of active in this area, writing papers called Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting. So what do you really want free will for? Well, you want it, in his view, to allow you to have morality. And he's not alone in that. That was also the view of St. Augustine 1600 years ago, is that you need some concept like free will in order to explain why people are sometimes right and sometimes wrong in their actions, and therefore why we have the ability to punish them. You need something like volition to explain why people can join the club that Dennett calls the moral agents club, the club which allows people to be members of a moral society. So there are several important features of volition which are clearly missing in previous experimental studies. The first one is, in fact, if you do the Libet experiment, you don't get many voluntary actions. People are sitting there watching the clock, and people are thinking, should I press the button now? Should I press it later? Probably what people are actually doing is trying not to make too many actions, because they have this belief that to be free is to take time about what you do and to think about it and to act not in the same way every time, a lot of sort of beliefs and social constructions. So if you want to study volition, you probably want to have a big data set. You probably want to have a high rate of generativity of human actions. You certainly want to capture the idea that human actions are very flexible. So you don't quite know what I'm going to do next, and I don't quite know what you're going to do next. We have very, very high behavioral repertoire. And that is a real interesting feature of the evolution of the frontal lobes in humans. So the number of actions that a human can do seems very, very high compared to the number of actions that a fish or a bird or a mouse can do. The actions that we make are goal-directed. So humans clearly have the capacity to imagine a counterfactual goal, to imagine something that is not currently within their sensory environment, but to make actions which will make it happen. So goal-directed action gives us an ability to change our environment and to change our experience. So I've used the phrase transformative agency to do this, to capture this idea. So this is quite important because if you look around you now, wherever you are, everything that you can see is going to be the product of a human voluntary action. So you can probably see a computer. In fact, by definition, you must be looking at a computer or a phone. You probably can see a chair, you can see a wall, you can see a house. You may be able to see some decoration. You can see lots of things which have been produced by humans by making voluntary actions, which created things, which made things happen, which built or transformed objects. So the human capacity to change the world is famous. It's dramatic. It's a point which Karl Marx, among others, has insisted upon. It's also extremely dangerous because the capacity to change the world includes the capacity to destroy it. But it's a unique feature of the human brain. So we are able to construct our environment much more than any other animal. And this feature of being able to make important things happen through choosing between any of the many available actions that we have in order to get closer to a counterfactual goal. This is what we really mean by volition. This is what we really need to be studying. And this is what we really need to find a cognitive mechanism for if we're to get close to this crucial feature of our own minds. So I've been trying recently to come up with a sort of a clearer and more objective, more comprehensive definition of volition, which captures what we're trying to define, and in particular, which tries to get away from the dualistic theological cultural heritage that surrounds the notion of free will. So when we talk about free will, we tend to remember cultural narratives which have come down to us through cultural history, and which are maybe not the only way or not the most obvious way to think about this unique cognitive capacity that we have. So when I've done that, it seems to me that that volition, if we think of volition as being the mental state which causes voluntary actions, it's got a number of properties, but it functions a bit like a cluster concept. To be voluntary and to have volition is to have some combination, have a mental state which satisfies some combination of these conditions. So volition ought to lead to movement. Volition ought to lead to consciousness. We're aware of our voluntary actions. Volition does not seem to involve external triggers. So if you tell me what to do, that doesn't seem to be voluntary, whereas if I decide what to do, that is. An interesting point about volition is it seems to be innovative or spontaneous. If I just decide to lift my arm in the air, then maybe that's voluntary. Whereas if I make a movement repetitively and habitually and do it in exactly the same way time after time after time, like breathing or like walking, then maybe that's not quite as voluntary. My voluntary actions need to be reasons responsive. They need to be linked to my rationality and to my motivation, and they are often directed at a particular goal or outcome. So no single one of these predicates. No single one of these conditions applies to all our voluntary actions. None of these may be necessary, but some subset of them may be sufficient. So if an action ticks enough of these boxes, then maybe it's voluntary, maybe volition is involved. Now, this is quite interesting because within this cluster concept, there are some conditions which are actually almost incompatible. So if you have an action which is innovative and spontaneous, then that seems to be incompatible with the idea that it's goal-directed. So sometimes we make actions which we feel are voluntary and which aim at a goal. So I really want to eat a pizza, and I'm going to start walking towards the pizza restaurant because that's what I really want. And that's my voluntary action, is to do everything I can to ensure that I eat that nice pizza this evening. But that seems completely different from the idea that I suddenly decide that I'm going to do something and I do it without any particular goal in mind. I spontaneously or seemingly randomly will produce an action. I'll just say a word because it comes into my head and I think it might be an interesting suggestion. It's not a reflection of a particular goal. So one of the interesting things about this cluster concept is it points towards a neural model of cognition, not as a single brain center, not as a single sort of seat of free will in the human brain, like Descartes thought the pineal gland was, but it points towards a neural view of volition as a distributed network, because each of these conceptual conditions, these theoretical conditions of volition, can be rewritten or thought of as a neuroanatomical constraint, a feature of the way that our brain works. So if volition exists in the human brain, it ought to be connected to the motor cortex somehow. If it involves consciousness, then it probably ought to be connected to the wide cortical network that underlies consciousness. It might have poor connections with sensory areas and with habitual areas like subcortical basal ganglia circuitry, but it should have strong connections to the areas that are involved in planning, etc., etc. So what I want to do now is to just briefly introduce a couple of experiments which are really at the preliminary stage, which my colleagues in my group in London and I are working on at the moment, which try to tick some of these boxes. I think the nature of a cluster concept is that you're never going to tick all of these boxes, but you might be able to think of experiments which give you a fairly rich concept of volition, but which can tick some of them. So I'm going to tell you about a verbal fluency experiment, and I'm going to tell you about a Tower of London experiment. These are both, I should add, preliminary data. And I should thank Zheng Huang for working on the verbal fluency data and Sylvia Segezzi for working on the Tower of London data. So I'd like to particularly acknowledge their contributions. So the idea about these sorts of experiments is that they might be a way forward beyond the impasse of the Libet experiment, which is sort of interesting, but a bit obvious and a bit unsatisfactory. How can we enrich volition? Okay, so the idea of verbal fluency is that you give people a rather interesting instruction. It's perhaps a bit strange, but it's certainly very clear. And the instruction is to give the names of as many different fruits as you possibly can in 60 seconds starting now. And often this is done by having people speak. So this is a quite standard test in neuropsychology. It's used as a test of dementia. It's used as a test of executive function. It's used as a test of language difficulties. It's in very, very common use in hospitals as a screening test for language ability and for cognitive ability in a very general sense. In our version, you don't say the names of the fruits, you type them. And it doesn't need to be fruits. It could be animals. It could be tools. It could be any category you want. But the idea is that you're generating ideas, objects, names, and then you're transforming those names, ideas into actions by typing them. So in any given 60-second trial, if you ask me to type the names of as many different fruits as I can, I might type apple. So here on the timeline, this is me typing A-P-P-L-E. Then there's a short delay. I might type plum, orange, and people can generate fine. And then they slow down and they start to think grape, melon, peach. So they typically, their generation of novel actions or novel words, we are thinking of the word and the action as being the same thing, goes down over time, and people can probably generate about 20 or between 20 and 25 such items in 60 seconds. Now, what we're interested in is using this as, I think, a rather natural and straightforward way of studying how people generate new actions, because what they're doing is they're using an effortful process of searching their verbal long-term memory. They're trying to think of all the kinds of fruits that they know the names of. They're generating these voluntary actions at a high rate, so one every few seconds. And the crucial point is that people have a distinctive subjective experience of finding the next word. You really know, oh, I can't think of another fruit. I can't think of another fruit. Bang, eureka, grape. It comes into your head and you think, got it. Okay. So there is, in verbal fluency, a sense in which people have a really clear phenomenal experience of, I know what I'm going to do next. I'm going to type G for grape. I know what I'm going to do next. I'm going to type M for melon. So this is a great opportunity to study the relationship between generation of actions, because there are many, many actions, and conscious experience, because we have a really simple way of probing the conscious experience. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to have randomly timed probe sounds, which are going to appear during the trial, like a beep. And this is going to interrupt or potentially interrupt the process of generating a novel action. So what we're going to do is, while the person is generating all these different kinds of fruit, we're going to play a beep. Think about it as being interrupted, a little bit like you're interrupted when the telephone rings. And we're going to try to time these beeps so that they happen in the gaps when people are trying to generate the next word. So we're going to make a statistical model of when people are likely to generate the next word, and we're going to try to interrupt them with the beep. And then we're going to ask, after we play the beep, we're going to ask, did you know what word you were going to type next? Did you know what word you were going to type next? And the person is going to answer either, no, I had no idea. I was still searching. I was still trying to retrieve a word from long-term memory, verbal long-term memory, or they might type, yes, I knew what word I was going to type next. And we're going to make sure that they haven't yet started typing. So we can link the timing of these beeps so that it always precedes the key press for the next word. Now, if the person says, yes, I did know what word I was going to type next, I just hadn't had time to type it, we can ask a follow-up question. Okay, please tell us what word you were about to type. And that's one way that we can make sure that they really did know what the word was, and it will become important later. So this continues until we've had 60 seconds of recording, and people are going to typically generate up to 30 words, and we're going to be able to probe them with these probes at least 2 times, sometimes more, sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8 times. So just zooming in now on a little part of the timeline, the idea is that the person might think of the word grape and they'll type the word grape. And the critical question is, when are they next going to type their next word? Now, we don't know that. We don't know exactly when they're going to think, oh, I know, melon. We can only estimate when the next word is coming, but we can do that building a statistical model of each person's generation of new words. And we can zoom in on this interval between the probe and the expected time of the next word. And imagine that we can put the probe in at any time that we like. So I've shown you several times when we might insert the probe. And we can hypothesize that if we insert the probe early on in this interval, long before we think they're likely to generate the next word, then probably they're going to answer no to our question, did you know what you were going to type next? But if we happen to time the probe so that it occurs just before they're about to type their next word, they're likely to answer, yes, I did know what word I was about to type next, and the word was melon. So the point here is that we expect a transition between not knowing in blue what you're going to do next and knowing in orange what you're going to do next. And if we have enough probes and enough trials, we computatively identify the moment at which you go from not having a voluntary action in mind to having a voluntary action in mind. It's the blue-orange boundary. And this is quite interesting because it's a new method. It's a chronometric method for estimating the moment of, if you like, conscious free will. I would prefer to call it conscious intention. It's also the moment of thinking of the word, but as soon as you can think of the word, then you type it, you know what to do. Because we're controlling when we make the probes, we can avoid some of the biases of sampling that occur if you simply look back before the time that the person actually acts, the biases that are associated with the readiness potential. But crucially, this method has a really clear phenomenology. People have a really clear experience of people are really, it's easy for people to answer the question no or yes about whether they had a word in mind. So basically, from this idea that people go from saying no to saying yes, we can imagine drawing a logistic regression where here 0 is the time after the previous word ended. So it's the time from the last word. This is when we think the next word is likely to occur, and we can put some confidence intervals on that. So this is the mean and the confidence intervals of when the word is likely to occur. And we think that if we probe them long before they're likely to start the next word, they're going to answer no when we ask them whether they're aware of what they're going to type. And if we probe them closer to the time that they're going to type the next word, they're going to say, yes, I was about to type another word, and the word was melon. So we can fit a logistic to that. We can look at the point at which they go from not knowing what they're going to do to knowing what they're going to do, and we can estimate the time of their conscious awareness relative to the estimated time that they're likely to act. A weakness of this, of course, is we don't know when they're actually going to act, but that's just an estimate. So this is exactly what Zheng Huang did, and it allowed her to estimate conscious intention time. So the preliminary results, this is just a small initial pilot study in a small number of participants. We've got a much bigger study that we're analyzing now. The initial results are quite interesting. So first of all, if you probe people early on in the 60-second trial, then what people tend to be actually doing is just reciting a list of obvious semantic associates. So suppose that I ask you to name as many foods as you can in 60 seconds. You're likely to say something like tea, coffee, red wine, white wine, rosé wine. You're likely to just use things which are sort of obvious. And in fact, what happens then is people are generating the actions so quickly that the estimated next word is less than a second after the previous word. And people almost always say, yes, I knew what I was going to type next. And we're really more interested in what happens when your memory seizes up and you don't know what the next word is, and you start thinking, any more fruits, any more foods, whatever the category is. You're trying, you're generating with difficulty, you're using high levels of innovation, and that to us seems like you're being more voluntary. So what you tend to find then is you tend to find that if you probe people, longer after the end of the last word, then that's likely to be closer to the estimated time of the next word. And they tend to say, yes, I do know what I was about to type. But if you probe them shortly after they finish the last word, then they're likely to say, no, I hadn't thought of the next word yet. I was still thinking, I had no intention in mind. So later on in the trial, you get this period where it looks as though you can randomly probe people and catch them at the moment where they go from not having an intention to type the next word to having an intention to type the next word. And the critical thing is that they can easily tell you that. It's straightforward for them to tell you something which basically says, yes, I was having a conscious intention. So you get a positive slope on the logistic regression, which shows that as time goes on, you're catching them closer and closer to the moment of action. And you can use this to estimate you can look back from the time at which you think they're going to start typing to the time at which they seem to report that their awareness starts. And it turns out that about 230 milliseconds before we think that they're going to start typing the next word, that's when they seem to kind of acknowledge that they had the word in mind, that they acknowledge that they were about to do something. So it's interesting that we're using a method which is massively different from Libet and avoids many of the problems that Libet had. Particularly, it's a rather nice natural task. It produces an estimate which is actually quite close to what Libet said. Okay, I now want to end with another completely different task, which solves a different set of problems around the experimental study of volition, which is the problem of how you can study actions that are meaningful. How can you study voluntary actions that are goal directed and that seem to solve people's problems, which seem to make things happen? So we've been using the Tower of London task, or TOL for short, which was developed by Tim Challis in the 1980s, and he used it initially to test patients with frontal lobe deficits. And it turns out this is a rather good way to find the deficit that patients with frontal lesions often have in the sort of organization and construction of complex behaviors. So frontal patients, they might seem okay on a lot of cognitive tasks, but they have real challenges in everyday life because they can't plan ahead and they can't do anything complicated. So in the Tower of London, you have a start configuration. So you get given these 3 balls on these 3 pegs, and your job is to move the balls one at a time until you reproduce a goal configuration. So the start configuration is this one that you see here, and then you have to turn it into the goal configuration by moving the balls one at a time, as you can see animated on here. So we can think of each movement of a ball from one peg to the next as being a voluntary action. You're producing a sequence of voluntary actions which gets you to a desired goal. The actions, crucially, are internally generated because you do have choices. So I'm sorry, I can't freeze the start position of this, so I can't show you what it looks like at the start position, but start position is now. That's the start position with the green on top of the blue. Now, it's up to you what you do as your first move. So you've got a choice. You could move the green ball or you could move the red ball. It may seem stupid to move the red ball, but you could do it. So the actions in this sense are internally generated and they're self-paced. You move when you want to. The actions are goal-directed and reasons responsive because you're trying to reproduce the goal, and then you get points, you get money. Crucially, these actions are each action is part of a complex chain of behavior. So it's like something like cooking, where you have multiple actions which all go to produce the final meal that you bring to the table. So many of the key elements of volition, and particularly many of the elements of voluntary action which make it important to us, are included in this task. So what's nice about the experiments that Sylvia has been able to do is that you can have a voluntary action problem. So here you have to get from this start configuration to this goal configuration. And you do it by a series of moves. So you've got the first move is to put the blue ball from here to here. And then the second move is to put the green ball from here onto here. So you can see a progressive move towards the goal. And you can have a control condition where you can tell people exactly what moves to make, and they're not actually choosing those moves themselves. So if you look carefully, you'll see that in the control condition, there are little red boxes, which I've highlighted with a very big red box, telling you, okay, what you want to do now, or what you must do now, is take the blue box and put it on the middle peg. So by comparing a situation where the person solves the Tower of London for themselves with a situation where we instruct them with stimuli, step by step, exactly what to do next, we can basically compare voluntary actions which aim at a counterfactual goal and those which don't aim at a goal at all. They're just slavishly copying a set of instructions. Okay, and that allows us to look at goal-directed volitional actions. And Sylvia, I should say, implemented exactly this in fMRI experiment, and she was able to contrast the self-generated actions compared to absolutely identical actions made in order to move the balls in Tower of London experiments, which were a series of instructed movements. And lo and behold, we get a large network, which basically resembles the network that has been found in previously voluntary action studies. And in particular, we get this strong activation of the medial frontal cortex, which I briefly showed before, and which is thought to be one of the key generators for the readiness potential. So it looks as though in the case of volitional action, you can see in goal-directed volitional actions exactly the same areas that have been found before. So in blue here, what you have is an overlay, which is a meta-analysis of 24 voluntary action studies of the sort of libet variety, the sort of rather meaningless variety where you get told to make an action whenever you feel like it, or make whichever of two actions you feel like making. So meaningless actions are shown in blue as a meta-analysis. And the sort of enriched volition that we're looking at with the Tower of London by comparing internally generated actions to stimulus-driven actions shows pretty much the same areas. So our attempt to enrich volition is still activating the voluntary action network in its classical areas. Now, what's quite interesting about this is when you look at the standard fMRI studies on voluntary action, they tend to all focus on the pre-SMA as if the pre-SMA was the kind of magic moment where free will switched the brain on. So the pre-SMA often seems to be discussed in this literature as if it was the modern version of Descartes' pineal gland. It's the uncaused cause. It's the first activation where free will takes hold. This is obviously wrong. This cannot be true. That's bad metaphysics. But we tended not to see in classical voluntary action studies anything interesting in front of the pre-SMA. We tended not to see any way or any plausible neurological explanation that the process of volition could start. We tended to see it as if it came from nowhere. And in the more complicated or more enriched context of problem solving through sequential actions, Sylvia was able to use a functional connectivity method of generalized psychological physiological interaction to put a seed in the pre-SMA and ask what are the brain areas that are connected, that are functionally connected to the pre-SMA, and which may show a particular role in bringing the sort of complex goal-directed problem-solving information and setting into the pre-SMA to trigger the action. So what's shown here is the brain networks that are revealed by PPI seeded in the pre-SMA, which are more strongly activated for the first move in the Tower of London sequence compared to all the other moves. So this idea of contrasting the first thing you do with all of the other things you do when you move the pegs, move the colored balls across from one peg to another. This is a fairly standard way of defining planning and complexity in sequence-based tasks. And there's lots of evidence that the process of dealing with complex goal-directed action happens building up to the first action in the sequence, and that the subsequent actions in the sequence are merely motoric. So this contrast that's defined here shows the network that is, if you like, involved in representing the whole of the goal-directed action sequence, as opposed to simply moving a ball from one peg to the other. And you can see that there's a big network of more anterior prefrontal regions which become functionally connected to the pre-SMA when you program and initiate a complex volitional chain of action. So enriched volition seems to connect the medial frontal cortex to a much wider prefrontal network, which we can associate with goal setting and with planning. So the pre-SMA is not the start or not the only sort of uncaused cause. It's not the magic moment where free will suddenly takes hold of our brain. The pre-SMA is the moment where all of our cognition, all of our prefrontal cognition, all of our executive function, if you like, gets translated from thoughts into actions to trigger the change in the events in the actual environment of moving the first ball onto the first peg, of committing the thought of how you're going to solve the problem to actually doing something. I'll leave out that contrast in the interest of time. So just to summarize, I think what I've tried to show is that through studying tasks like verbal fluency, we can look at what is the association between consciousness and the innovation of a novel movement in the absence of an external trigger. So we can look at the whole sort of now I know what to do aspect of volition. And using the Tower of London, we can look at the reasons responsive and goal-directed planning on the basis of an internal representation, which leads to movement. So we're able to tick selective boxes within the cluster concept table and provide a richer view of volition. So just to conclude, it seems to me some people think that free will should be eliminated and that volition cannot be studied and it's metaphysically incoherent and it doesn't exist and I don't know, we're all zombies. So some people have a kind of a negative view, and I'm perhaps unusual because I don't think that volition is rubbish, and I don't think that it needs to be just dismissed or reduced out of existence or explained away or attacked. I think it is a cognitive process, and I think it is a subjective mental state, and I think it is associated with our actions, and I think it is important. And I think it's important if we can understand the cognitive mechanism. I think this is worth doing because I think it's something on which our humanity depends. Now, I think if we're going to make these big claims about responsibility and societal flourishing, we clearly need a richer concept of volition than the ones that we have perhaps quite rightly started with. We cannot criticize Kornhuber and Libet for starting simple. That's absolutely fine. It's good to start simple, but it's good to also aim, once you've understood basic mechanisms, it's good also to try to use them to provide clear and reductive explanations of richer and more contextual mechanisms, and in particular, the high generativity of human action and the distinctive awareness of the actions that we're about to make, and our ability to plan and achieve actions using appropriate means and structures according to our motivations. So somehow our volition is connected to our rationality. This is really important. If you have volition that is not connected to rationality, you have, I don't know, Friedrich Nietzsche or something like that, and that's not very safe. So it's quite important to understand the way that our volition is connected to our wider cognition. I think that means the kind of links between the medial frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex that I discussed in the context of the last experiment. So there's a really big question coming up at the end of all this, which is, can an enriched science of volition help to close the gap between the mechanistic neuroscientific accounts that we can generate about our own motor mechanisms, about the way that our own cognitive brain is linked to our motor brain, and the societal expectations, what society wants to know about volition and responsibility, about how we can hold each other responsible, about what we do when people claim they're not responsible because they have an unusual set of brain circuitries or brain operations, the problems that our colleagues in forensic psychiatry raise all the time, the problems that occur when we think about the future threats of neurotargeting and neuromarketing. Can we actually get a cognitive science which can speak into those questions? So I don't have an acknowledgement slide, and I must apologize that I don't have a formal thank you slide. So I'm going to give the formal thank you slide now. There are many, many people who've done all of the work behind all of these experiments, many collaborators and colleagues. So I'd like to particularly single out two collaborators, Stefan Bode and Steve Fleming, and two colleagues in my group who have actually been doing all of the work, who are Zheng Huang, who worked on the verbal fluency, and Sylvia Sagetsi, who worked on the Tower of London. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize, I've run a couple of moments over the hour. Thank you.
That's all good. That's all good, Professor. Thank you so much for the speech and the talk. So we will give a short 5-minute break before the Q&A session.
Good idea.
So let's be back by 11 past, and then we'll go on with the Q&A session.
See you then.
Before we move on, so it's, everything is organized. I will ask every person that wants to ask a question to digitally raise a hand from the reaction section on Zoom, and then we can go. Okay, yep, Ozip, you can go on.
Yep, sure. Thanks for the great talk, by the way. It was, for me at least, it was really interesting because I'm not used to studying more philosophical and psychological stuff in my studies. So I have a really boring question first, but I think I'm gonna keep that and ask it later. But my more interesting-ish question is that I know that talking about AI and large language models in this type of sense is very, like, some people kind of frown upon it because they don't think it can be studied in a more like experimental design or whatever. But just I wanted to learn how you think about this subject, and just like I was reading the article yesterday, so but I thought about like whether we can do the verbal fluency experiments to a more advanced GPT-4 ChatGPT model in like 2 years. It's like,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's really interesting. So, of course, LLM is always a big question at the moment in every domain. And so I think I would say two things. So first of all, you can certainly do verbal fluency experiments with ChatGPT, and we're doing them. So it's quite interesting to ask ChatGPT, please think of as many fruits as you can, and look at what comes out. So you can certainly use it as a perhaps an exemplar of what a very large memory of word associations is, and you can get it to generate. And that's quite interesting. So there are probably some quite useful things that you could do by comparing the kinds of words generated by ChatGPT with the kinds of words that are generated by human participants. In particular, if you ask ChatGPT to generate words, it will do it, right? Whereas if you ask human participants to generate words within a particular category, they will eventually start to struggle, right? So there's a profound limit on the ability to retrieve items from verbal long-term memory. And this is not just about the number of items you know. So for example, if you take the trial that I gave, which was how many fruit can you think of? After a while, you'll start saying, and you'll be hunting. ChatGPT doesn't do that. It just keeps generating as many fruits as it can from its database. But even when you feel you've run out of fruits, if I then give you the name of a fruit, you'll say, oh yes, why didn't I think of that before? So there's obviously some sort of capacity limitation in our ability to get the information that we need to generate the action, and that's different. And that presumably reflects a difference in the memory storage between humans and large language models. Just the other thing, of course, that needs to be said about large language models is that they are just large language models and they can't connect to actions. So the important point about human voluntary action is not only that you can generate candidate actions, which would correspond to words in a verbal fluency experiment, but you can then say them or type them or whatever. So the good thing about the verbal fluency task is it captures this idea that there are lots and lots of actions that you could make, just like there are lots and lots of words that you could say. But it also seems to capture this critical point that using a word is an action, so it changes the world. So there are some words that I could use to you now, right here in this discussion, which would be profoundly, they would really change things. I'm not going to use those words because it probably would be wrong, but this is just an indication of the idea that the capacity to transform a thought into an action can sometimes be transformative.
Yeah, thanks. Just as a quick follow-up, do you guys do like any sort of so like conscious free will type of experiments with large language models, or?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, first of all, I'm not sure I believe in conscious free will. Second, very large language models. So I think they have will. I don't think they're, and I don't think they're conscious. So I will be quite interested to see how models can be special. People study. I'm worried that my internet is frozen. Hear me?
Professor, I think you cut off now, but I think it happened in the talk as well, but it resolved pretty quickly. Okay. Yeah, we'll wait a couple minutes.
I don't know, it's fine. Hello, Sylvia has rescued me because my Zoom froze. So thank you so much. So I think it would be interesting to use large language models as a research tool, but I think I don't think they're conscious. I don't think they're free, and I don't think they have volition. So you know, we're just learning, really.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, I do agree with the claim that what makes, the study of volition is, ultimately making sense of how it relates to societal responsibility. And I have a question.
That's why we need to ask the questions. That's right. Or one of the motivations for studying the topic. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And I have a question specifically on that. So when we speak of concepts like reasons, intentions, goals, they seem to be, at least in the first glance, they seem to be a bit first personally contaminated, I will say. So is there a risk of contaminating the whole study of volition in this sense, that we can't, make sense of these sort of, because, when we think about actually societal responsibility, we do not only think about first personal stuff, but we also need to think about second personal stuff and intersubjective stuff as well. So is there a risk of, undermining the whole study of volition in this sense when we make reference to these sorts of concepts, so that we don't get a concrete grip on what's happening intersubjectively? That's what I wanted to ask, and what you think.
It's a really interesting question. I can't give a definitive answer, but I think volition sort of has to be first person, or it has to embrace the first person. So one of the reasons why it's interesting is because there is a distinctive experience that, as far as I can tell, we all have, or we each have, of being in control of our own actions. And that experience seems to be somehow linked to our capacity to control our own actions and our capacity to decide. And therefore, it's quite natural that considerations about responsibility need to engage with that first person experience. But the problem is that, well, not the problem, the beauty is that because we're social animals and we interact with each other, the consequences of my action affect you, and the consequences of your action affect me. And therefore, there's a sense in which the first person perspective is not enough. So I would not, I think volition starts with the first person, but it's not a solipsistic problem, or it's a problem that even solipsists will have to deal with, which is that voluntary actions affect others. So it's also natural, because we inhabit a shared space or a public sphere as social animals, it's also natural that there has to be a second person account of volition, or indeed a third person account of volition. And that's what I think what responsibility is. That's much more concerned really with the fact that your voluntary actions will have outcomes which affect me. And all of the problem really comes in transacting the first person with the second person or third person. So if you do something bad and you are caught, you're taken to a court of law, and the first question that they'll ask you is, are you guilty or not guilty? Did you do that action? Was that a voluntary action that you made? And in most in many legal systems, you can say, well, actually, this was not a voluntary action. No, people might not believe you. Probably people are correct not to believe you, because it may not convince anybody. But there are several examples where we hold people responsible for actions that are voluntary, but we don't hold people responsible for actions that are involuntary. Now, of course, it's always tricky to say whether an action is voluntary or not, but it clearly shows, the fact that we have legal situations to deal with that problem clearly shows that the
the issue of transacting the first and the second person elements of volition and responsibility, respectively, is perhaps just a major cognitive challenge which needs to be resolved at a societal level. So the thing that's interesting about volition is it happens in the first person's brain, but it's of very major importance for intersubjectivity, or well, not even intersubjectivity, interpersonality. Right, for a social species, the wide range of the voluntary action of the individual is something that needs societal regulation, shall we say?
All right, thank you so much.
Good questions.
Thank you. Hassan, yes, you can go on.
Try and go back to. Is that right? I'm gonna go back to my see if my laptop is up.
Okay, yep.
Hello, yes, Hassan, I'm ready for your question. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is about philosophical implications of Libet kind of experiments.
Yeah.
So obviously, these experiments are telling us something, which is conscious will can be determined before the conscious will occur. So this is interesting. However, if you're not a dualist, wouldn't it be the just natural consequence? So this is my first question, and I think somehow related. Another question is when you were presenting implications of Libet's experiment, I mean, from your graph, I inferred that one of the conclusions that you make is conscious will is not the cause of the action. However, I mean, even if it's predetermined, isn't there some room still? Consciousness is determined by unconscious neural activity, and then this conscious decision is still being the cause of the action.
Yeah, that's a great question, Hassan. I think you're right that the Libet experiment is perhaps the result of the Libet experiment is not surprising if you're a materialist. So if you believe, for example, that the brain is the basis of our experience and our conscious mental life, which I believe, and I think everybody in neuroscience believes, then it has to be that the brain activity starts and the conscious awareness comes second. It cannot be that consciousness is first and brain activity is second. So at one level, the Libet experiment is not surprising. At another level, I think we are all dualists in our everyday life. You know, so the habit of talking and thinking dualistically is very difficult to avoid, and maybe we don't need to avoid it. Maybe it actually is a useful way of getting around in the world, but it seems that it cannot be scientifically true. So I think the problem with the Libet experiment is it becomes difficult to say what is the role of consciousness. It seems as though we are conscious of our voluntary actions. It seems as though we have at least a sort of a background buzz experience of what we're doing as we do it, or while we are doing it. And you remember I presented a block diagram which showed the brain causing the action, and the consciousness is like a side, it's like the CC on an email. So what's it for? Where does it go? Why do we need it? Why don't we just become zombies? Maybe our actions could be equally good without consciousness. So since Libet, I think it's become quite difficult to give useful and clear stories about what is the role or logic of our conscious experience of our own voluntary actions. I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, deep down, I suppose I hope that it's something to do with learning. I suppose it's because I hope that if I have a conscious experience of what I'm doing, it will be easier for me to change it when I realize that it did not work or should be done better. So I think the attribution of reinforcement learning errors and credit assignment may perhaps be more efficient for high-level action control when you have a clear conscious experience of what your action was. But that is a belief. I cannot give you any evidence. I cannot give you any evidence for that. And that worries me. So, you know, we spend a lot of time studying the subjective experience of action, but we still don't have good cognitive theories about why that subjective experience exists in the first place. I hope it's related to learning, because I hope we can use our conscious experience of action to learn to make better actions. But I worry that that is a kind of a naive optimism that I have.
Okay, thank you.
Mert, yes, you can go.
Hello, Professor Haggard. Thank you for the great talk. I'm wondering if you think there are fields of study that are peripheral and can be informative and useful to the study of volition. One that I can think of is the perceptual stability. Even though our visual perception is disrupted continuously, we have the sense of continuity. And I was wondering if there's any relevance in between these two subjects.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about fields of study within, within cognition broadly construed. You're not talking about chemistry or physics yet. Maybe you will later. So I think that's a really interesting point. So I think there are two things to say. I've focused very much on volition as a kind of a motor, or as the top end of the motor system, the point where our goals and our wider cognition is capable of driving our behavior. But many of the problems of, for example, prediction, stabilization, and what you might call what I call generativity, so making things happen, a lot of those seem to happen also within perception. So if you look at things like binocular rivalry or perceptual stability, you often get a flip between one percept and another without any change in the stimulus. So that ticks the box that I said that any perceptual switch would be independent of the sensory input, which is one of the markers of volition. And more generally, it fits with a big question that philosophers often ask, which is, what about the voluntary control of thoughts? What about mental actions? So I'm not sure I like the term mental actions, but it's very common in philosophy. So people in philosophy often think that the important part of volition is the capacity to direct your mental contents. And the fact that this then has consequences on your behavior, the fact that this makes you press one button rather than another, is kind of secondary to them. That's not the most important part. So that idea says that the really interesting feature of volition is the capacity to think about the left button or the right button. It's not the capacity to actually press the left button or the right button. Now, Ongun asked about the second and the third person. The second and the third person can care much more about my action than about my thought. So I have always slightly felt that the really important problem is, how do our thoughts link to our behaviors? I mean, thoughts are interesting, but they're particularly interesting if they change what people do. There has been a little bit of work trying to study voluntary top-down, it's often called top-down attention, but I think it's basically volition, trying to study volitional control of bistable stimuli. My understanding is that seems to involve the sort of prefrontal cortex broadly understood, or broadly similarly. Most of that work is reverse correlation fMRI, so it has some difficulties. Quite often you get some really interesting bistable stimuli. For example, if you have dots which are ambiguously rotating rightward or leftward, one of the things that you'll notice is that you can massively change your percept if you make a voluntary action like that or like that. So if you use your voluntary motor system to fake control over a bistable stimulus, you can get brilliant perceptual control of it. So you can, that to me teaches that the idea that maybe volitional control of action is somehow the original or basic or sort of real reducible example of our capacity to change our thoughts. And maybe the ability to change what you perceive without acting is somehow derivative on motor imagery or on motor preparation. And that, of course, I would like that, because that would put the motor actions first and the perception second. But that is perhaps a motor chauvinist point of view. But those experiments are extremely interesting, and they feed nicely into this question about whether we control our mental contents in the same way that we control our actions.
Great, thank you so much. Put in that way, it sounds like the phenomenology is not really weak. It's actually quite strong. But yeah, I guess that's just a personal opinion. Thank you very much.
Sorry, the phenomenology in perceptual experiments can be extremely strong. So the problem with the perceptual experiments, you can generate really great phenomenology about, whether you're seeing a face or a house if you're doing a CFS type experiment, or whether the dots are moving to the left or the right. The problem with the perceptual experiments is that it's difficult to get a good objective marker of the moment when the volition happens. Right. So the behavior is great because it's highly measurable. And one of the problems with studying volitional control of non-motor events is that it's difficult to measure them. It's just a measurement problem. But if you can't measure something, it's difficult to study it. So that I know that there are great people working on that problem, not me, but maybe you work on that area yourself. It's a very interesting literature.
Yes, thank you very much.
I do have another question if no one is willing to. Okay. So we talked about, biomarkers of volition, and we saw the Libet experiment and Trugger experiment. So in those experiments, if I'm not missing anything, we seem to be focusing on when this sort of conscious experience of agency, happens, let's say. But I see why that is. But is there any way in which we could, at least try to answer the question of, why does these biomarkers result in such subjective experience of, or a sense of agency?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So there are two ways in which your word "when" is very relevant. So first of all, in the Libet experiment, people are making a decision about when to act. So the only thing that is free, the only bit of information that they generate, is when they press the button. There's only one button. So a lot of people have said that, that's not really the point about voluntary action. The key point about voluntary action is that there are lots of things that you could do. There's a very big response space. And we've written a bit on this idea that there are several. There's an interesting question about whether generating information about when to act and generating information about what action to make involve the same circuits or not. So that's one aspect of when. The second aspect of when is on the measurement side. So the whole method is chronometric. So I mean, going back to Wilhelm Wundt in the 19th century, it's clear that when is a very good question to ask in psychology. If you want to understand a cognitive representation or a cognitive structure, then the timing of subjective experience is one of the best ways that we have of understanding the content of subjective experience. So Libet's question about when did you feel the urge to move turns out to be quite an important way of understanding what it is that people are actually reporting. You know, what is it? What is the conscious experience? So I think mental chronometry is a good methodological approach in general. You were also asking the question about, or I think at the end of your question, you were asking about, can we understand how, can we get better evidence about how the biomarkers might, or whether the biomarkers actually reflect a causal process that generates the experience at that particular moment that the experience happens. And I think, I mean, biomarker approaches are not causal, they're correlational. And we have to use causal methods. And there's some good work by Itzhak Fried, which has used direct stimulation of the human brain in patients with intractable epilepsy undergoing neurosurgical operations. And when he stimulated in the medial frontal cortex in patients who are completely awake and just sitting still, they would occasionally, depending on where they were stimulated, they would occasionally say things like, I really want to move, or I feel an urge to move. The word urge is there again. They would report these experiences which sounded a little bit like volition. Another thing that they quite often said, interestingly, was, I feel as though I am about to move. So that is quite interesting. It's causal evidence. Now it's taken in, there isn't much of it because these patients are rare and these stimulations are limited for clinical purposes, but it's very interesting. It's very interesting that stimulating in the medial frontal cortex can generate a conscious experience, which people describe in the language of will. If you stimulate more strongly in the same locations, then people actually move. It's not a voluntary movement, it's an involuntary movement, and it's caused probably by either leakage of the current or by transneuronal activation in the primary motor cortex. But what's really interesting is the bit of the body that actually moves when you stimulate strongly is generally the same body part that they previously reported having an urge to move when they were stimulated at lower current. So if you stimulate at low current, they will tend to say, I feel I want to move my right arm, or I have an urge to move my right hand. They can report the body part, so they know what they want to do. And if you stimulate harder, that's the body part that actually moves. So that tells me that the conscious experience, or some conscious experience, which sounds a little bit like volition, is generated preparatorily. It's not a retrospective confabulation from the fact that you move. It's generated even before you've moved. And it's generated as part of the physiological mechanisms of the normal recruitment of the way that we move when we're not being stimulated, but move physiologically as opposed to artificially. So that work by Itzhak Fried, I think, is extremely valuable, although it's not a lot of data. It's extremely valuable in explaining how particular brain circuits both contribute to our movement and to our experience that we will move.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really interesting considering how specific it can get to.
Yeah, it's surprising. I mean, it must be said neurophysiologically that the medial frontal cortex is just in front of the primary motor cortex, and it has a somatotopic map. It's not as clean as the somatotopic map of Penfield in the primary motor cortex, but several authors have noted that there's a broad somatotopic organization, and you need to go quite far forward in the frontal lobe before somatotopy completely disappears, right? So the somatotopy is strongest in the pericentral regions around the motor and somatosensory cortices. But you get somatotopy as you move progressively outwards towards sort of higher association cortex. And you get it quite a long way into the brain's abstract areas too.
I see. Yes, Ozak, you can go on.
So, coming to my boring question. So I'm studying data science, and I was wondering what kind of other experiments did you think about, especially with the what was it called? Sorry, the verbal fluency one. So looking at it, I was just like, you obviously use logistic regression, but like, what kind of other generalized linear models and just like probit, CF, what kind of other models did you think about? And also the second part, yeah, sorry, the second part is that so obviously we are treating humans as the subjects, and there's a really big potential to come across systematic measurement error too, just like they would intentionally or unintentionally give the wrong answer to yes or no, whatever. So how did you deal with that too?
Yeah, those are both really good questions. Thank you very much. So dealing with the first one, so I mean, all of the everything that I presented really is quite descriptive. So the models that we're using are models for the statistical analysis of data sets, and logistic regression is a very standard model in psychometrics for understanding the causes of a binary response variable. So if you get any kind of task where people switch from saying no to saying yes as something changes, or vice versa, then logistic regression is a standard method of looking at the dependence of a binary response variable on an underlying continuous causal variable. And people argue about whether one should fit logits or probits and so on. It typically doesn't matter all that much if you're just trying to extract some estimates of, you know, when people have conscious experience. I think in general, there's an interesting question about whether one could have big data models of volition. And that's really interesting, because if you look at the current revolution in data science around sort of tracking human behavior, you could say that it's like a gigantic free will experiment. So if you start looking at, you know, what do people click on in Amazon, then there are two ways of interpreting that. There's two ways of interpreting sort of behavior, and particularly consumer behavior. One is that it's all the kind of stimulus-driven behavior that I've said is not volition. You know, it's like responding to it. It's all reflexive. You know, the handbag on the website was so good, I had to click and I had to buy it, even though it cost $1,000, because it was Prada. I was just reflexively responding to the Prada label. So that's one interpretation of kind of consumer big data. But the other interpretation, which is widely favored in economics, is that somehow our consumer behavior reflects some sort of deep internally generated choices, and sometimes it's called expressed preference in economics. But I think there are plenty of people in economics who would treat consumer behavior as being an expression of free will, right? And that then opens the possibility for using big data, particularly big data from purchasing decisions, as a sort of an indirect window into human volition. So I think that would be quite interesting. I would personally challenge that, because I would say that, you know, not everybody has money to buy. And I think there are a lot of people who have just as much volition as I have, but who perhaps are less fortunate and don't have the money to buy the Prada handbag. And I would say they have volition too. So I'd be a little bit worried that kind of consumer behavior is really an intersection between human volition and sort of factors like luck, money, taxation, politics, power, lots of very kind of dirty things like that. But I think it will be very interesting to see whether with the new data science can tell us things about volition. The second thing that you said in your question, you used the phrase systematic measurement error, and you particularly associated that with sort of human experiments. And I think that's a really interesting concept, which corresponds to what psychologists call task demands. So task demands is a very bad phrase, which is widely used in psychology. So when you ask people to do an experiment, then the people who are generating the data, the volunteers who participate in the experiment, they kind of have some intuitions about why you're doing the experiment. And they kind of have some idea about how they can help or how they cannot help, or whether they like the experiment or whether they don't. They produce sort of schemas in their mind to help them deal with the situation. So one complaint about the Libet experiment is that in a Libet experiment, you're asked to press the button whenever you feel like it. And probably what people are doing is they're thinking, well, this guy in the white coat is studying volition, so probably he does want me to press the button, and probably he wants me to do it in the way that corresponds to, quote, free will, unquote. And what does that mean? Well, it means maybe behaving a bit randomly. It means behaving, in a slightly funny way. It means not doing things the same every time. So really what you're studying in that experiment is some kind of joint fiction or joint storytelling that the experimenter and the participant do with each other to say, hey, this is what we think free will is. And that's really bad. That's a really bad experimental technique. So good psychological experiment, it should be difficult for the participant to help. It should be difficult for the participant to cheat. It should be difficult for the participant to use their ideas about what they think the hypothesis is to generate data before in favor of or contrary to the hypothesis. So a good psychology experiment, the person should just come in and kind of understand what they're supposed to do and do it in a straightforward way, and then take their money and go. And this whole idea of what people think the experiment is about, that should be eliminated. And that's really hard to do in voluntary action experiments, really hard. One of the things that's quite nice about both of the experiments that I showed you for both verbal fluency and Tower of London problem solving is it's really simple to say to the participant, this is what we want you to do, now please do it. It's really simple to describe what the task is, and it's quite simple for the participant to do it. We don't need to tell them that we're interested in volition. We can just say, please move the balls on the peg until you get the red, green, blue pattern. So basically, if we're doing our job correctly, then we should really fight against what you call systematic measurement error. We can't make it completely disappear, but the more we can produce circumstances where the measurement error is just random, the better we are at our job.
Just as a quick follow-up, sorry, Hassan, but I have to go in 10 minutes. So you talked about the Amazon purchase behavior and stuff. Like, there are techniques to overcome that, especially like with fixed errors and random effects and whatever. Fixed effects, sorry, not fixed error.
Yeah.
So like, would you say that using those kinds of methods, just like within this big data, would that be beneficial for psychology and neuroscience in the future? Or
well, it's not for me to say what psychology or neuroscience needs, and there are lots of those sorts of papers appearing as we speak. So there are lots of people who've got, for example, access to loyalty card purchasing data, where people are generating as many purchases per week as our participants are generating words in a minute. So you get lots of data very quickly, and you get it longitudinally, and people are analyzing it in terms of endogenous decision making. So I think it remains to be seen whether this actually really does tell us interesting things about how people express their preferences and so on. And I expect it will be interesting in some ways, but not in others. I think one of the most interesting things will be trying to understand the balance between sort of goal-directed behaviors and innovative behaviors or spontaneous behaviors. This is what's called in psychology the explore and exploit. So we're always moving along a continuum where we're trying to find something new, and at the other end of the continuum, we're just doing things that we know work. And this is a very general structuring principle which underlies all human behavior, and I think big data probably can contribute there.
yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for the great talk.
Hassan, before you, we have a question in the chat box from So he asks, as far as I could see, single gyrus of limbic lobe was not involved in the images you have shown that represent volition, but we know that lesions on single gyrus may lead to extreme akinetic mutism.
Yep.
These patients do not show up any voluntary spontaneous movement, although they are conscious. So I would like to ask why single gyrus was not in the image that present active regions of volition, since damage in that area impairs voluntary movements.
Right, that is a really great and actually very deep and profound question, and so thank you very much for that. I'm not sure I can really answer it. So first of all, quite a lot of volition studies do find that the medial frontal cortex activations associated with generating an internal generation of an action as opposed to stimulus triggered action, they do go quite deep. So some of them do go into the paracingulate cortex. So there's a little bit of sort of distribution of depth all the way from the surface on the convexity right the way down into the cingulate. Secondly, do you remember that when I was showing the functional connectivity analysis, when you put a seed in the pre-SMA, when people are planning this complex sequence of voluntary actions to solve the problem, one of the regions that you get connectivity to is anterior to the pre-SMA, but deeper, and that would count as cingulate cortex. That would count as the rostral part of the anterior cingulate cortex. It's not subgenual, but it's rostral anterior cingulate cortex. So we know that the cingulate cortex has this functional connectivity to the pre-SMA, and my own sort of feeling, and I haven't read all the papers on this, but my own sort of feeling is that the way to think about the anterior parts of the cingulate cortex is in terms of motivation. And maybe the reason why lesions there can produce akinetic mutism is not that the person cannot move, but the person perceives no reason to move. There's no point, you know, why bother, right? So this would be perhaps this would capture the point that our actions are normally made for a reason. So if you don't have reasons, you won't produce actions. There's quite a lot of evidence that, for example, patients with Parkinson's disease who can show a hypoactivation in the anterior cingulate limbic lobe because of the limbic loop through the basal ganglia. There's quite a lot of evidence that the lack of movement in Parkinson's disease is not only a motor deficit, but also a motivational deficit. So if you motivate Parkinson's patients to move more, then they can. And that suggests that maybe the reason why they don't move very much, or their movements are impoverished, is because they're not motivated. So there's the motivational story in the anterior part of the cingulate lobe, but then it's worth remembering that in the mid-cingulate area, there's lots and lots of monkey studies which identify a so-called CMA, a cingulate motor area. And they identify neurons which, I think some neurons in that territory make a direct projection to the spinal cord. Also, many make indirect projections to the spinal cord, relaying through the brainstem motor nuclei. So as you go along the cingulate cortex, there seems to be this gradient from, you know, reasons for action through to actual actions. And I expect that probably if we can get better techniques for studying the motivation for acting and the reasons why people act, and if we can somehow break the study of reasons away from the dominance of reward, then we might be able to tell a more interesting story about the anterior portions of the cingulate cortex and their role in volition. If we look at the ways that we can study actions in humans, so often it ends up with reward-based decision making. And if you pay people £10 to press the left button and £5 to press the right button, then you can very quickly, you know, experimentally take control of their free will, if you like, and you can begin to study choices. But it seems to me that it's not only about reward, and there are these other theoretical constructs of which motivation is extremely important. Good question.
Thank you for the answer. I suppose we don't have any further questions.
I think it's late for you. It's not that late for me, but it's late for some of you. So yeah.
All right. So I think we can close it up. Professor, thank you again so much for accepting our invitation, and thank you to the participants for all the good questions as well.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for your sort of enthusiastic seminar series and your great questions. Great to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.